In a quiet suburban garage in Maple Street, a 68-year-old widow was about to shatter her family's comfortable assumptions. What started as an evening of being banished to sleep among lawn mowers and storage boxes took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the truth about who she really was. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical helpless dependent. For 18 months, she had spent her life building a thriving automotive empire next door, known for her sharp business acumen and quiet leadership of 12 employees. When they encountered her shuffling around the house asking for help with simple tasks, they had no idea they were walking into the most elaborate performance of vulnerability ever staged. Margaret's calculated deception that would lead to the complete destruction of her son-in-law's superiority complex. What began as a grieving widow seeking family connection would become a masterclass in hidden strength. The neighborhood would never be the same after Derek Martinez discovered his burden was actually the most successful entrepreneur on the block. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen shuffled across the kitchen linoleum, her slippers making the soft scraping sound that had become part of the morning soundtrack at 247 Maple Street. She moved with deliberate slowness, her shoulders slightly hunched, pausing to steady herself against the counter as she reached for the coffee pot. The performance had become second nature over the past 2 years. "Morning, Mom," Sarah called from the hallway, her voice carrying the hurried tension of someone perpetually running late. "There's oatmeal on the stove if you want some." "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied, her voice carrying just the right note of grateful frailty. She watched through the kitchen window as Derek backed his silver BMW out of the driveway, his jaw set in its usual expression of barely contained irritation. Even from this distance, she could see his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in her navy scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. At 38, she carried the same determined set to her chin that Margaret recognized from her own younger years, though Sarah's was softened by an exhaustion that seemed to settle deeper into her bones each month. "Will you be okay today?" Sarah asked, the question routine but genuine. "I'm pulling a double at the hospital, so I won't be home until after midnight." Margaret nodded, stirring honey into her tea with trembling fingers that weren't quite as unsteady as they appeared. "I'll be fine. Maybe I'll do some light cleaning, watch my shows." "Please don't overdo it," Sarah said, grabbing her keys from the hook by the door. "And remember what Dr. Patterson said about your blood pressure." The front door closed with a decisive click, followed by the sound of Sarah's Toyota starting up and pulling away. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching until both cars disappeared around the corner. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her posture straightened. The tremor left her hands. Her shuffling steps became purposeful strides. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, moving past the framed photographs that documented her life's supposed decline. Wedding pictures with her late husband Robert, family gatherings where she appeared increasingly frail. Sarah's graduation from nursing school where Margaret sat in a wheelchair she'd rented for effect. The real Margaret had been standing just fine that day, but the family had insisted on the chair after her dizzy spells. From her dresser drawer, beneath layers of cardigans she never wore, Margaret retrieved a slim leather portfolio. Inside were documents that would have shocked her family: profit and loss statements, employee contracts, insurance policies, and a business license that read, "Chen's Auto Repair, owner, Margaret L. Chen." She changed from her nightgown into practical clothes, dark jeans, a cotton blouse, and steel-toed boots that she kept hidden in the back of her closet. 20 minutes after Sarah's departure, Margaret Chen, successful business owner, slipped out her back door and walked the 30 yards to the chain-link fence that separated her daughter's property from the thriving auto repair shop she'd been running in secret for the past 18 months. The key turned smoothly in the side entrance lock. The familiar smell of motor oil, metal, and honest work greeted her like an old friend. the shop was already humming with activity. 3 cars, up on lifts, the sound of pneumatic tools, and the steady rhythm of productive enterprise. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Carlos Mendoza called from beneath a Honda Civic. At 52, he had the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught, combined with the loyalty that had made him her perfect front man. "Eddie's having some trouble with that transmission on the Silverado. Could use your eye on it." Margaret smiled, feeling the day's first genuine emotion. This was her real world, where her age was an asset, her experience valued, her decisions respected. "Where is he?" She found Eddie Santos crouched beside the disassembled transmission, his young face creased with concentration. At 26, he was a single father working 2 jobs, and Margaret had hired him 6 months ago after watching him jury-rig a customer's alternator with nothing but wire coat hangers and determination. "The torque converter's not engaging properly," Eddie said without looking up. "All the specs say it should work, but something's off." Margaret knelt beside him, her practiced eye taking in the scattered parts. "What does your gut tell you?" "That the problem's not mechanical, it's electrical, but I can't find the short." "Look at the solenoid housing," Margaret said, pointing to a component that appeared pristine. "Sometimes the problem isn't what's broken, it's what looks perfect but isn't functioning." Eddie's eyes widened as he followed her guidance. Within minutes, he'd located the hairline crack in what appeared to be a flawless casing. "How did you know?" 40 years of marriage to a man who rebuilt engines for fun," Margaret said. "You learned to look beyond the surface." The morning passed in a rhythm that felt like meditation. Margaret reviewed the quarterly reports. Profits were up 23%, largely due to their new contract with the city's fleet maintenance department. She approved the hiring of a second female mechanic, knowing it would boost their reputation and provide mentorship opportunities. She authorized the purchase of a new diagnostic computer system that would position them ahead of their competitors. At lunch, she walked to Jessica Park's coffee shop 2 blocks away, resuming her frail widow persona as soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Jessica, a Korean immigrant who'd built her own business from nothing, was one of the few people who knew Margaret's secret. "How's the family treating you?" Jessica asked, her voice carefully neutral as she served Margaret's usual chamomile. "Same as always," Margaret replied. "Derek's been particularly vocal about the burden I represent." Jessica's expression hardened. That man wouldn't know value if it ran him over with a truck. Margaret sipped her tea, watching through the window as several of her employees enjoyed their lunch break. Eddie was teaching a younger mechanic how to properly torque lug nuts, passing on the knowledge she'd shared with him just weeks before. The sight filled her with quiet pride. "Sometimes I wonder if I should tell them," Margaret said. "But Sarah's so stressed already, and Derek." She let the sentence hang. "And Derek's ego couldn't handle learning his burden is more successful than he is," Jessica finished. "The question is, how long can you keep this up?" Margaret didn't have an answer. She returned home, slipping back into her role just as Tommy's school bus rounded the corner. Her 16-year-old grandson bounded up the driveway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a grease stain on his jeans that he tried to hide from his parents. "Hey, Grandma," he said, kissing her cheek. "How was your day?" "Quiet," she said, meaning it in ways he couldn't understand. "How was school?" "Boring. Could we maybe work on that engine diagnostic stuff again? In the garage?" Margaret's heart swelled. Tommy had inherited the family's mechanical aptitude. But more than that, he had the curiosity and respect for learning that Derek had never possessed. Their secret sessions in the unused bay of her shop had become the highlight of both their days. "Of course," she said. "But Tommy—" "I know. Don't tell Dad." His young face clouded. "I don't understand why he has to be so mean to you." "Neither do I," Margaret thought, but she simply squeezed his shoulder. Some people show love differently than others. They spent an hour at the shop, with Margaret teaching Tommy how to read compression readings while Carlos discreetly supervised. The boy had natural talent. His hands were steady, his mind quick to grasp the relationship between symptoms and causes. As they walked back to the house, Margaret heard Derek's voice through the kitchen window, sharp with frustration. "I don't know how much longer we can do this, Sarah. Your mother's been here 2 years. 2 years of watching every penny because we're supporting dead weight." Margaret paused, Tommy beside her, both of them frozen by the casual cruelty of the words. "She's my mother, Derek." Sarah's voice was tired, defensive. "She lost everything. When Dad died? The insurance barely covered the funeral." If only you knew, Margaret thought. The insurance had indeed been modest, but she'd used Robert's pension savings to buy the failing auto shop next door, turning it into something that now generated more monthly income than Derek's middle management salary. "That's not our problem," Derek continued. "She needs to be in a facility where professionals can care for her. This house isn't big enough for all of us, and frankly, I'm tired of tiptoeing around someone else's grief." Tommy's face flushed with anger, but Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's go around front," she whispered. They entered through the front door, Margaret resuming her shuffle, Tommy struggling to contain his indignation. Derek appeared in the hallway, his expression shifting to false concern. "Hey, Mom, how are you feeling today?" "Fine, thank you," Margaret replied, noting how he called her Mom with the same tone others might use for an unwelcome obligation. Good. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." Derek's smile was practiced, the same one he probably used with difficult clients at his tech company. "My mother's coming to visit next week. Rita's really excited to see the family." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd met Rita Martinez exactly once, at Sarah and Derek's wedding 8 years ago. The woman had spent the reception criticizing everything from the flower arrangements to Sarah's dress choice, all while lamenting how her son was throwing himself away on someone who'd never appreciate his potential. "That's wonderful," Margaret said. "I'll try to stay out of the way." "Oh, you don't have to do that," Derek said, but his eyes suggested otherwise. "Though we might need to. Rearrange some things. Make sure everyone's comfortable." Behind him, Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression carefully neutral. But Margaret caught the flicker of concern in her daughter's eyes, the same look she'd worn as a child when trying to prevent a confrontation between her parents. "We'll figure it out," Sarah said quickly. "There's plenty of room." Derek's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course there is. We're family." As Margaret climbed the stairs to her room that evening, she reflected on the day's contradictions. In her real life, she was respected, valued, successful. In this house, she was tolerated at best, actively resented at worst. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so exhausting. She sat at her small writing desk, updating the private journal she'd kept since Robert's death. Today's entry was brief. Derek's mother arriving next week. The performance is about to get much more difficult. Through her bedroom window, she could see the soft glow of the security lights at Chen's Auto Repair. Tomorrow, she would return to her real world, making decisions that affected 12 employees and their families, building something that mattered. Tonight she was just a burden, counting down the days until Derek's patience finally ran out. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, Margaret found herself curious about what would happen when Derek finally pushed too far. She had resources he couldn't imagine, allies he'd never met, and a strength that 2 years of play acting hadn't diminished. Perhaps it was time for the performance to end. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, Margaret found herself curious about what would happen when Derek finally pushed too far. She had resources he couldn't imagine, allies he'd never met, and a strength that 2 years of play acting hadn't diminished. Perhaps it was time for the performance to end. That resolve carried her through the next morning's routine, though she noticed Derek watching her more carefully as she prepared her breakfast. His scrutiny felt different, calculating rather than dismissive. When he spoke, his tone carried the false cheer of someone delivering bad news wrapped in false kindness. "Mom, I've been thinking about next week," he said, not looking up from his laptop screen. "With Rita coming, we'll need to make some adjustments to keep everyone comfortable." Sarah paused in packing her lunch, her shoulders tensing. "What kind of adjustments?" "Nothing major," Derek said, though his fingers tapped against his coffee mug in the rhythm Margaret had learned to recognize as anxiety. "Just some temporary changes. Rita's not as flexible as she used to be. She needs her space, her routines." Margaret continued stirring her oatmeal, letting the silence stretch until Derek was forced to fill it. "I think it would be best if you could stay in your room during the day while she's here," he said finally. "Give her run of the common areas. She's very particular about her environment." The spoon stilled in Margaret's hand. "I see." Sarah set down her lunch bag with more force than necessary. "Derek, this is Mom's home too." "Of course it is," Derek said quickly. "This is just temporary. A week, maybe less. Rita's been through a lot since Dad passed. She needs to feel like she can breathe, you know?" Margaret knew exactly what Rita needed: control, validation, and the assurance that her son prioritized her comfort over everyone else's. She also knew that Derek's nervousness had nothing to do with his mother's grief, and everything to do with his desperate need for maternal approval. "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I'll make sure to stay out of the way." Derek's relief was visible. "I knew you'd understand. You're always so reasonable about these things." Reasonable. The word sat bitter in Margaret's mouth. She'd been reasonable when Derek suggested she sell her car because her reflexes were declining. She'd been reasonable when he'd taken over her finances to reduce her stress. She'd been reasonable through 2 years of steadily diminishing freedoms, all justified by concern for her well-being. Sarah remained silent, her internal struggle playing out in the tension around her eyes. Margaret had seen that same expression on her daughter's face since childhood, the look of someone who knew the right thing to do but lacked the courage to do it. After they left for work, Margaret walked to her shop with more purpose than usual. The morning air felt sharper, charged with the electricity that preceded storms. Inside Chen's auto repair, she found Carlos reviewing paperwork at the small office desk. "Mrs. Chen," he said, standing quickly, "I was just about to call you. We got news about the city contract." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. They'd submitted their bid for the municipal fleet maintenance contract 3 months ago, a deal that would nearly double their monthly revenue and establish them as one of the premier shops in the county. "And?" she asked, though Carlos's grin had already given her the answer. "We got it. Full contract, 3-year term with options for renewal." Carlos handed her the official letter, his weathered hands trembling slightly with excitement. "Mrs. Chen, this changes everything. We'll need to hire at least 4 more mechanics, maybe expand into the empty bay next door." Margaret read through the contract details, her business mind automatically calculating the implications. The guaranteed monthly income would exceed what Derek made in a good year. The prestige of maintaining the city's emergency vehicles, police cars, and municipal trucks would attract other high-value clients. Most importantly, it validated every risk she'd taken since buying this failing shop. "Have you told the others?" she asked. "Not yet. Wanted you to hear first." Carlos paused, studying her face. "You don't look as happy as I expected." Margaret sank into the office chair, the weight of her double life suddenly feeling unbearable. "Family complications," she said simply. Carlos nodded. In their 18 months working together, he'd learned to read her moods, to understand when Her careful compartmentalization was beginning to crack. He'd also seen the bruises on her spirit that came from spending her days being treated as an inconvenience by people who should have cherished her. "Want to talk about it?" Margaret found herself describing Derek's latest demands, the upcoming visit from Rita, the gradual erosion of her place in what was supposedly her home. Carlos listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Mrs. Chen," he said finally, "with respect, why do you let them treat you like this?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret had asked herself the same thing countless times, always arriving at the same complicated answer. Grief had made her vulnerable. The desire to be close to Sarah and Tommy during the worst period of her life had made her accept conditions she never would have tolerated before Robert's death. But somewhere along the way, accommodation had become habit, and habit had become trap. "Because," she said slowly, "I thought if I was small enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, they'd let me stay close to my family. I thought if I didn't cause problems, didn't assert myself, they'd see me as a blessing instead of a burden." "And how's that working out?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Derek just banished me to my room for a week so his mother can have her space in my daughter's house." Carlos was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 parents. Maybe it's time they learned who they're really dealing with. The idea settled into Margaret's chest like a seed finding fertile ground. She thought about the city contract, about the employees who depended on her leadership, about the thriving business she'd built from nothing while her family pitied her supposed helplessness. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." That afternoon, Tommy arrived at the shop with unusual enthusiasm. He'd aced a test in his automotive technology class, and his teacher had asked him where he'd learned so much about engine diagnostics. "I told him my grandmother taught me," Tommy said proudly, then caught himself. I told him a neighbor did. Sorry, Grandma, I almost slipped." Margaret felt a pang of sadness that her own grandson had to lie about her competence, but she pushed it aside. "Show me what you learned today." They spent an hour working on a carburetor rebuild, with Tommy demonstrating the techniques she'd taught him while adding insights from his classroom instruction. The boy had genuine talent, better hands than some of her professional mechanics, and an intuitive understanding of how systems worked together. "Tommy," she said as they cleaned their tools, "what would you say if I told you that someday this shop might be yours?" His eyes widened. "Really? But Dad says—" he doesn't think I should waste time on blue-collar work." "And what do you think?" Tommy looked around the shop, at the busy mechanics, the satisfied customers, the tangible results of honest labor. "I think Dad doesn't understand what real work looks like." That evening at dinner, Derek dominated the conversation with details about Rita's arrival. She'd be taking the guest room, which meant Tommy would move to the basement den. Meals would be served in the dining room instead of the kitchen. Margaret was expected to take her meals either before or after the family to avoid overcrowding. "She's very particular about noise levels," Derek explained, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "Maybe you could watch TV with headphones, and we'll need to limit visitors while she's here. Rita values her privacy." "What about my study sessions with Grandma?" Tommy asked before he could stop himself. Derek's attention sharpened. "Study sessions?" Tommy flushed, realizing his mistake. "Just homework help. Sometimes Grandma helps me with math." "Where exactly do you do this homework?" "In the garage," Tommy said weakly. "It's quiet out there." Margaret felt Derek's suspicion like a physical weight. His eyes moved between her and Tommy, calculating, analyzing. She'd been careful about their shop visits, but apparently not careful enough. "That's thoughtful of you, Mom," Derek said finally. "But I think Tommy's old enough to handle his homework independently. Don't you, son? I guess, Tommy mumbled, shooting his grandmother an apologetic look. Sarah had remained silent throughout the exchange, her conflict evident in every rigid line of her posture. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe we could work out some kind of schedule, she suggested. So everyone gets time in the common areas. Derek's smile was sharp as broken glass. Sarah, honey, my mother is our guest. We accommodate her, not the other way around. That's what families do. The implicit message was clear. Rita was family, in a way that Margaret apparently was not. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to Derek and Sarah's muffled argument through the thin walls. She couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was familiar. Derek's aggressive certainty against Sarah's exhausted protests, ending inevitably with Sarah's capitulation. Tomorrow, Rita would arrive, and the delicate balance Margaret had maintained for 2 years would finally shatter. The question was whether she'd let Derek dictate the terms of that destruction, or whether she'd finally take control of her own narrative. Through her window, the lights of Chen's auto repair glowed like a beacon. Somewhere in that building was a file folder containing contracts, financial statements, and employee records that told a very different story about Margaret Chen's value to the world. Perhaps it was time the world, and her family, heard that story. Through her window, the lights of Chen's auto repair glowed like a beacon. Somewhere in that building was a file folder containing contracts, financial statements, and employee records that told a very different story about Margaret Chen's value to the world. Perhaps it was time the world, and her family, heard that story. But first, she would have to survive Rita Martinez. The black Lincoln Town car pulled into the driveway at precisely 11 o'clock Friday morning, driven by a taxi service that charged more per hour than most of Margaret's mechanics made in a day. Through her bedroom window, Margaret watched Rita emerge from the back seat like a queen surveying her temporary kingdom. At 71, Rita Martinez had aged into the kind of woman who wielded her years like a weapon. Her silver hair was sculpted into an immaculate helmet, her makeup applied with precision that suggested vanity rather than care. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, accessorized with gold, jewelry that caught the morning light with each calculated movement. Derek appeared on the front steps before Rita had fully extracted herself from the car, his entire body vibrating with nervous energy. Margaret had seen him anxious before, but this was different. This was a man desperate to prove himself worthy of love that had always come with conditions. "Mom!" Derek's voice carried through the house with forced enthusiasm. "You look amazing! How was the flight?" Rita allowed herself to be kissed on both cheeks, her expression suggesting mild tolerance rather than maternal warmth. "Long," she said simply. "That airport is impossible to navigate these days. All those young people rushing around with no consideration for their elders." Margaret watched Derek's face cycle through expressions: concern, validation, barely contained panic. She recognized the dynamic immediately. Rita established dissatisfaction as her baseline emotional state, forcing everyone around her to scramble for her approval. "Let me get your bags," Derek said, practically sprinting to the taxi's trunk. "Sarah's at work, double shift at the hospital, but she'll be home tonight. And Tommy's at school, but he's so excited to see you." "I should hope so," Rita replied, her gaze sweeping across the front yard with visible assessment. "This lawn needs attention, and those flower beds look neglected." Margaret felt a flash of irritation. Sarah had spent her weekend off weeding those flower beds, trying to make everything perfect for Rita's arrival. The criticism was both unfair and predictable, another test for Derek to fail. From her strategic position at the upstairs window, Margaret watched Derek struggle with 3 oversized suitcases while Rita supervised, offering commentary instead of assistance. The woman had packed for a week-long visit as if she were relocating permanently. "Careful with that one," Rita instructed as Derek wrestled with a particularly heavy case. My medications are in there, and my special pillows. My back hasn't been the same since your father passed. Margaret noted how Rita claimed ownership of grief, as if losing a spouse were a unique experience that others couldn't possibly understand. It was a familiar tactic, emotional monopolization designed to make others feel inadequate in their own suffering. The front door opened with a ceremonial flourish, Derek's voice echoing through the house. Welcome home, Mom. Home, the word, hit Margaret like a physical blow. This wasn't Rita's home. It was Sarah's house, where Margaret had been living as an increasingly unwelcome guest. But Derek's choice of words revealed how he truly saw the hierarchy. His mother's comfort superseded everyone else's claim to belonging. Margaret waited 15 minutes before making her first appearance, timing her entrance to coincide with Derek's grand tour of the main floor. She descended the stairs with her practiced shuffle, one hand trailing along the banister for effect. Rita, she said with genuine warmth, welcome. It's wonderful to see you again. Rita's examination of Margaret was thorough and calculating, taking in every detail from her sensible shoes to her gray cardigan. The assessment lasted long enough to be deliberately uncomfortable before Rita responded with a smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret, you're looking, well? The pause before well suggested otherwise. I hope my visit won't be too much of an imposition. Of course not, Margaret replied, though they both understood the subtext. Rita's presence was designed to be an imposition, a test of who truly belonged in Derek's life. Mom's got some great ideas for improving the house, Derek interjected with manic enthusiasm. She's always had such good taste. Rita's gaze moved past Margaret to survey the living room, her expression suggesting mild disappointment with the decor choices. Well, everyone has different standards, I suppose, though I do think some spaces could benefit from professional attention. Margaret bit back her first 3 responses, settling for a neutral nod. She'd decorated this room with Sarah during those difficult months after Robert's death, choosing colors and furniture that brought comfort during the darkest period of her life. Rita's casual dismissal felt like another small death. I should let you get settled, Margaret said. I'll be upstairs if you need anything. Actually, Derek said quickly, Mom and I were hoping you could show her around the neighborhood. Later. You know, the local spots, the coffee shop, that sort of thing. Margaret recognized the trap immediately. Derek wanted her to play tour guide to establish Rita's territorial claim over the area, while simultaneously positioning Margaret as the helpful subordinate rather than a fellow resident. Of course, Margaret said. I'd be happy to. The morning continued with a series of small humiliations disguised as family bonding. Rita rearranged the living room furniture to improve the flow, moving chairs and tables that Sarah had positioned for Margaret's comfort. She reorganized the kitchen cabinets to be more efficient, relocating items to heights that Margaret would struggle to reach. Each change was presented as helpful optimization while actually serving to establish dominance. Derek enabled every adjustment with enthusiastic approval. That's so much better. Mom, you always know exactly what needs to be done. By noon, Margaret felt like a stranger in a house where she'd lived for 2 years. Every familiar comfort had been subtly altered, every routine disrupted in service of Rita's preferences. The message was clear. This wasn't Margaret's home anymore. The breaking point came during lunch preparation. Margaret had offered to make sandwiches, a simple gesture she'd hoped might bridge the growing tension. Rita observed her work with the intensity of a culinary critic, offering a steady stream of corrections disguised as suggestions. That's quite a lot of mayonnaise, Rita noted as Margaret assembled a turkey sandwich. Some people don't realize how much fat they're adding to their diet. I'll use less, Margaret replied, scraping off half the spread. And the bread seems a bit thick. Don't you think thinner slices would be more elegant? Margaret cut new, thinner slices, her jaw tightening with each adjustment. Personally, I prefer my lettuce crispy, Rita continued. This seems a bit wilted. Perhaps it's been in the refrigerator too long. Derek watched this performance with obvious satisfaction, as if Rita's criticism of Margaret somehow validated his own treatment of his mother-in-law. Mom always notices these details, he said proudly. She taught me to appreciate quality. Margaret set down the knife with deliberate care, her patience finally approaching its limit. I'll pick up fresh lettuce tomorrow, she said, her voice level despite the fury building in her chest. Oh, don't trouble yourself, Rita said with false magnanimity. I'm sure Derek can handle the grocery shopping while I'm here. Men are often better at selecting fresh produce anyway. The casual dismissal of Margaret's competence in her own daughter's kitchen, using groceries she'd helped purchase, felt like a slap. But what truly stung was Derek's eager agreement. Absolutely. I'll take care of all the shopping this week. Can't have you ladies worrying about those heavy bags. Ladies? As if Margaret and Rita were equals in helplessness, both, dependent on Derek's masculine strength for their survival. Margaret wanted to laugh at the irony. Derek, who couldn't change his own car's oil, positioning himself as the household's capable provider, while dismissing the woman who ran a business he couldn't even imagine managing. The rest of lunch passed in a haze of subtle cuts and veiled insults. Rita criticized the coffee, a bit weak, the temperature of the house, rather chilly, and the view from the dining room window. Those houses across the street could use some maintenance. Each complaint was delivered with the expectation that Derek would immediately address it, and he leaped to accommodate every suggestion. Margaret excused herself as soon as politeness allowed, claiming fatigue that wasn't entirely feigned. But instead of retreating to her room as expected, she slipped out the back door and walked the 30 yards to her real sanctuary. The crisis that greeted her at Chen's auto repair made the morning's domestic drama seem trivial by comparison. Carlos met her at the door, his usually calm demeanor cracked with worry. The main lift is down, he said without preamble. Hydraulic failure. We've got the city's fire truck scheduled for inspection this afternoon, and the backup lift can't handle that weight. Margaret felt her business instincts engage, pushing personal frustrations aside as she focused on the problem. The fire department inspection was part of their new municipal contract, a high-visibility job that could make or break their reputation with the city. How bad is the hydraulic system? She asked, following Carlos to the disabled lift. Eddie thinks it's the main cylinder. Could be a seal, could be the pump. Either way, we're looking at parts and labor that'll take at least 3 days. Margaret knelt beside the lift mechanism, her trained eye taking in the hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the cylinder housing. The familiar smell of oil and metal helped ground her after the morning's emotional assault. This was a problem she could solve, a challenge that responded to expertise rather than politics. Call Morrison Heavy Equipment, she instructed. Tell them Margaret Chen needs emergency hydraulic service. Use my name specifically. I helped them out of a jam 2 years ago when their main truck went down during harvest season. You think they'll prioritize us? I know they will, Margaret said with confidence born of years building relationships in an industry where reputation meant everything. And call the fire chief directly. Explain the situation, but assure him we'll have his truck handled by end of business today. Carlos nodded, already reaching for his phone. Margaret spent the next hour coordinating the emergency repair, calling in favors accumulated over 18 months of careful relationship building. Morrison's crew arrived within an hour, their lead mechanic greeting Margaret by name and treating her with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. While the hydraulic repair proceeded, Margaret handled 3 other crises that would have crippled a less experienced operation. A parts delivery arrived with the wrong components, requiring her to personally drive to the supplier and negotiate an immediate replacement. A longtime customer complained about a repair estimate, forcing Margaret to review the work and find a more cost-effective solution. 2 employees had a dispute over scheduling that threatened to disrupt the afternoon's workflow. Each problem demanded the kind of decisive leadership that Derek couldn't imagine her possessing. Margaret made decisions involving thousands of dollars, managed personalities and egos, and maintained the careful balance of authority and approachability that kept her business running smoothly. By 4 o'clock, the fire truck inspection was complete, the customer disputes resolved, and the emergency hydraulic repair finished ahead of schedule. Morrison's crew chief personally thanked Margaret for her business and reminded her to call if she needed anything else. "Anytime, Mrs. Chen," he said, shaking her hand with genuine respect. "You run a hell of an operation here." As his truck pulled away, Margaret felt the satisfaction that came from competence recognized and problem solved. This was her real life, a world where her age was an asset, her experience valued, her decisions trusted. The contrast with her morning at home couldn't have been sharper. Margaret returned to the house as the shadows lengthened, resuming her shuffle as she approached the back door. Through the kitchen window, she could see Rita holding court at the dining room table, while Derek hung on her every word. The scene looked like a masterclass in manipulation, Rita's apparent frailty demanding constant attention while her sharp eyes monitored every response. Tommy sat at the table with them, his expression carefully neutral as his grandmother dominated the conversation. Margaret caught his eye through the window and saw the same trapped look she'd seen on Sarah's face that morning. Another generation, learning to accommodate Rita's demands. Another family member being trained to prioritize her comfort over their own needs. When Margaret entered through the back door, the conversation paused just long enough to acknowledge her presence before resuming. Rita was describing her late husband's business acumen, painting a picture of entrepreneurial success that positioned Derek as the heir to greatness. "Your grandfather built that company from nothing," Rita told Tommy with the authority of someone reciting family mythology. "Started with just a desk and a telephone, ended up employing 50 people. Derek has that same vision, that same drive. It's in the blood." Margaret almost choked on the irony. Rita was describing exactly what Margaret had accomplished with Chen's auto repair, but attributing those qualities exclusively to the men in her family. The dismissal was so complete, so unconscious, that Margaret wondered if Rita even saw her as a fully realized person rather than just another piece of furniture to be rearranged. "Where were you this afternoon, Mom?" Derek asked with casual curiosity. "I stopped by your room around 2, but you weren't there." Margaret felt the weight of multiple gazes as she considered her response. The truth would shatter her carefully maintained facade, but lying was becoming increasingly difficult. "I went for a walk," she said finally. "Just around the neighborhood. I needed some air." "You should be careful," Rita interjected with false concern. "Women our age shouldn't be wandering around alone. So easy to get confused, or fall, or worse." The casual assumption of shared infirmity made Margaret's teeth clench. Rita was only 3 years her senior, but she spoke as if they were both doddering invalids requiring constant supervision. "I'm quite steady on my feet," Margaret replied mildly. "For now," Rita said with the knowing smile of someone who'd appointed herself the authority on aging. "But these things change quickly at our age. One day you're fine, the next day you're flat on your back wondering what happened." Derek nodded sagely, as if Rita had shared profound medical wisdom. "Maybe we should look into getting you one of those medical alert systems. You know, just in case." The suggestion hung in the air like another chain being forged. Margaret could see the future Rita and Derek were constructing for her. Increasing restrictions justified by escalating concerns, each limitation presented as caring protection rather than control. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said, "but unnecessary." "Famous last words," Rita said with a laugh that held no humor. "Pride goes before a fall, literally in this case." As dinner preparations began, Margaret found herself relegated to the role of observer. Rita had assumed command of the kitchen with Derek as her eager lieutenant, the two of them working together to create a meal that would demonstrate proper family hierarchy. Margaret's offers to help were politely declined, her suggestions diplomatically ignored. "Why don't you just relax?" Derek suggested when Margaret offered to set the table. "You've done enough for one day." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Margaret retreated to the living room, where she could hear Rita's running commentary on Sarah's spice collection, Derek's kitchen skills, and the general state of household management. Every observation carried an implicit criticism of the women who'd been running things in Rita's absence. When Sarah finally arrived home from her double shift, exhaustion radiating from every line of her body, she found her kitchen transformed, and her role usurped. Rita greeted her daughter-in-law with the kind of effusive warmth that demanded gratitude for the usurpation. "Sarah, darling, I hope you don't mind, but Derek and I took care of dinner tonight. You work so hard, you deserve to be pampered." Sarah's smile was fragile as tissue paper. "That's very kind of you, Rita." "Well, family takes care of family," Rita declared, somehow making the statement sound like both a blessing and a warning. "Though I do think this kitchen could use some reorganization, so hard to find anything with the current system." Margaret watched her daughter's face carefully, seeing the moment when Sarah realized that Rita had rearranged 2 years' worth of carefully organized domesticity. Sarah's eye twitched almost imperceptibly, the only sign of the frustration she was too exhausted to express. Dinner was a performance of family harmony directed by Rita and enthusiastically supported by Derek. Conversation topics were carefully curated to showcase Derek's achievements while positioning everyone else as grateful beneficiaries of his success. Margaret found herself described as lucky to have such a devoted son-in-law, and Sarah as blessed to have a husband who understands her demanding career. Tommy remained largely silent, answering direct questions with minimal responses while avoiding his grandmother's increasingly pointed observations about his future. Rita had opinions about his education, his hobbies, and his apparent lack of clear career direction. "When Derek was your age," Rita told Tommy over dessert, "he already knew he wanted to be in business. Had that drive, that focus. Boys need direction, need to understand the value of ambition." Margaret felt the implied criticism of Tommy's mechanical interests, his quiet nature, his satisfaction with hands-on work rather than corporate climbing. Rita was systematically dismantling everything that made him unique, replacing it with expectations that would reshape him in Derek's image. As the evening wound down, Rita began making observations about the house's layout and functionality. Her comments were presented as casual conversation, but Margaret recognized the strategy, establishing dissatisfaction with current arrangements as a prelude to demanding changes. "It's such a cozy house," Rita said, her tone suggesting that cozy was a diplomatic way of saying cramped. "Though I do think some of the space could be better utilized." Derek leaned forward with obvious interest. "What do you mean?" Rita's smile was calculatingly innocent. "Well, it's probably not my place to say anything." "Mom, please. Your input is always valuable. It's just that some houses work better when there's clear definition of space, when everyone has their proper place, their own territory." Rita's gaze drifted toward Margaret with practiced casualness. "Sometimes people just need more room to spread out, to really feel at home." The message was unmistakable, though delivered with enough ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability. Rita wanted Margaret gone, or at least significantly marginalized, and she was already planting the seeds for Derek to make that happen. Margaret felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, not fear, but a crystalline clarity about what was coming. Rita hadn't come for a visit. She'd come to reclaim her son and establish her vision of proper family hierarchy. Margaret was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved. As she climbed the stairs to her room that night, Margaret could hear Rita and Derek continuing their conversation in low conspiratorial tones. She caught fragments, phrases like difficult situation and what's best for everyone, and permanent solutions. They were planning her future without her input, making decisions about her life based on assumptions about her capabilities and needs. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more challenges to her place in the family structure. But tonight, Margaret sat at her small desk and reviewed the financial statements from Chen's auto repair. The numbers told a different story about her capabilities. A story of growth, success, and leadership that would shock everyone downstairs if they knew the truth. Perhaps it was time they learned exactly who they were trying to displace. The morning brought with it the sound of Rita's voice drifting up from the kitchen, already in full command mode despite the early hour. Margaret lay in bed listening to the orchestrated symphony of her displacement, Rita directing Derek on proper coffee preparation, critiquing the breakfast options, and establishing her authority over the domestic routine with military precision. "Derek, honey, I was thinking," Rita's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "You know how I mentioned yesterday about space utilization? I did some research online last night." Margaret's blood chilled. She'd heard that tone before, the false casualness that preceded life-altering pronouncements. Rita had spent less than 48 hours in the house, but she was already moving to the next phase of her campaign. "What kind of research?" Derek's eager response confirmed Margaret's worst fears. He was ready to embrace whatever solution his mother proposed, regardless of its impact on anyone else. "Senior living communities," Rita said, her voice bright, with manufactured enthusiasm. "Some of these places are absolutely wonderful these days. Like resort living, really. Activities, social interaction, professional care. Everything someone Margaret's age could want." Margaret felt her chest tighten. In Rita's world, someone Margaret's age was code for someone whose usefulness has expired. The casual dehumanization wrapped in concerned language was a masterclass in manipulation. "That's actually a really good idea," Derek said, his relief audible. "I mean, if it's what's best for her." "Of course it is," Rita replied with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own judgment. "These places are designed specifically for people in her situation. Much better than having her feel like a burden on family." The word burden hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret knew it would be repeated, refined, and reinforced until everyone accepted it as objective truth rather than Rita's calculated assassination of her character. Margaret dressed with mechanical precision, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but Rita's efficiency was breathtaking. In less than 3 days, she'd identified Margaret as an obstacle and developed a strategy for removal. Downstairs, she found Rita and Derek huddled over Derek's laptop at the dining room table, their heads bent together like conspirators. The screen displayed glossy photographs of manicured lawns, smiling seniors, and institutional architecture disguised as home-like comfort. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. Derek looked up with the guilty expression of someone caught planning an intervention. "Morning, Mom. We were just researching some options." "Options for what?" Rita's smile was radiant with false benevolence. "For your future, dear. Derek and I have been looking at some absolutely lovely senior communities, places where you could really thrive." Margaret studied the laptop screen, noting the careful marketing language designed to make imprisonment sound like liberation. "I see. This one looks particularly nice," Rita continued, clicking to a new page. "Sunset Manor. They have a wonderful activities program. Bingo, crafts, movie nights. And the dining room looks just like a fine restaurant." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret read between the lines with practiced skill. Sunset Manor was the kind of place where independence went to die, where capable adults were reduced to supervise children participating in organized activities designed to fill time until death provided final release. It's expensive, Derek added quickly, but don't worry about that. We'll figure out the finances. The casual assumption that she had no finances of her own would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. Derek was prepared to impoverish himself to pay for her incarceration, never imagining that she could buy the entire facility outright if she chose. That's very thoughtful, Margaret said carefully. But I'm quite comfortable here. Rita's expression shifted subtly, revealing the steel beneath her grandmother's mask. Of course you are, dear. But sometimes we have to think about what's best for everyone involved. Everyone. The word encompassed Derek's comfort, Rita's preferences, and Sarah's supposed need for space. Margaret's own desires were conspicuously absent from the equation. These places really are wonderful, Rita continued, warming to her theme. Much better than trying to maintain independence when it becomes challenging. There was that word again. Challenging. Rita was systematically redefining Margaret's competence as disability, her self-sufficiency as stubborn denial of reality. Derek nodded enthusiastically. And you'd have so much more social interaction. People your own age, shared interests, professional staff to help with daily activities. Daily activities. Margaret almost laughed at the irony. While Derek worried about her ability to manage basic self-care, she was running a business that employed 12 people and generated more revenue than his corporate salary. I appreciate your concern, Margaret said, but I'm not ready for that kind of transition. Rita's smile became more fixed, her patience wearing thin with Margaret's failure to embrace exile with appropriate gratitude. Sometimes we're not the best judges of our own needs, dear. It takes loving family members to help us see what's really best. The manipulation was so blatant, it took Margaret's breath away. Rita was positioning herself as the voice of wisdom, while casting Margaret as a confused old woman incapable of rational decision-making. Sarah entered the kitchen at that moment, already dressed for work but moving with the sluggish exhaustion of someone operating on minimal sleep. She took in the scene, the laptop, the conspiratorial posture, her mother's carefully neutral expression, and Margaret watched understanding dawn in her daughter's eyes. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "We're exploring some exciting options for your mother," Rita said brightly. "Some really lovely communities that might be perfect for her." Sarah's gaze moved from Rita to Derek to Margaret, her internal struggle playing out in the tension around her eyes. Margaret could almost hear her daughter's thoughts, the recognition that this was wrong warring with her ingrained need to avoid conflict. "Mom?" Sarah said quietly. "What do you think?" Margaret felt the weight of the moment. This was Sarah's chance to stand up for her mother, to assert her own authority in her own home. But Margaret could see the exhaustion, the overwhelming pressure Sarah was under, the impossible position of being caught between her husband and her mother. "I think it's something to consider," Margaret said carefully, sparing her daughter the burden of choosing sides. "Though I'd want to see these places before making any decisions." Derek's relief was palpable. "Of course, we could arrange tours, maybe visit a few this weekend." Rita clapped her hands together with theatrical delight. "What a wonderful idea! We could make a day of it. Maybe lunch afterward? Really take our time?" Margaret nodded, already formulating her plan. If they wanted to play this game, she'd play along until she was ready to reveal the truth. Let them tour facilities and discuss finances and plan her future. Meanwhile, she had a business to expand and a revelation to orchestrate. After Derek and Sarah left for work, Margaret endured 2 hours of Rita's commentary on the benefits of senior living. Rita had apparently spent the night researching, not just facilities but arguments designed to overcome resistance. She spoke knowledgeably about socialization benefits, health monitoring systems, and the peace of mind that came from professional oversight. The hardest part, Rita said with practiced sympathy, is letting go of the illusion of independence. Once you accept that it's time for help, everything becomes so much easier. Margaret listened to Rita systematically dismantle her autonomy while planning her counterattack. Every condescending word, every assumption of incompetence, every casual dismissal of her capabilities was fuel for the fire building in her chest. When she finally escaped to Chen's auto repair, Margaret felt like a diver breaking the surface after too long underwater. The familiar sounds of productive work, the smell of honest labor, the sight of her employees solving real problems with tangible solutions. It all served to ground her in reality after the morning's exercise in manipulation. Carlos took one look at her face and immediately ushered her into the office, closing the door behind them. "Bad morning?" he asked without preamble. "They want to put me in a home," Margaret said simply. Carlos's expression darkened. In the 18 months they'd worked together, he'd become protective of Margaret in ways that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with respect. He'd seen her handle crises, make tough decisions, and build something meaningful. From nothing. The idea of her being warehoused in some institutional facility was personally offensive to him. "Over my dead body," he said with quiet vehemence. Margaret smiled for the first time that day. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I think it's time to stop hiding." They spent the next hour discussing strategy. The city contract had created opportunities for expansion that would require significant capital investment. Margaret had the resources, but revealing them would expose her secret. The timing needed to be perfect, dramatic enough to shock her, family but professional enough to maintain her business relationships. "The new bay construction could be the trigger," Carlos suggested. "Hard to hide that kind of expansion from the neighbors." Margaret nodded, studying the financial projections. Spread across the desk, the numbers told a story of unqualified success, profit margins that would make Derek weep with envy, growth rates that established her as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the county. "How long for permits and construction to begin?" she asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we expedite everything." "Do it. Pull all the permits, hire the contractors, order the equipment. Make it visible." Carlos grinned. "What about your family?" "Let them plan their tours and research their facilities," Margaret said with grim satisfaction. "By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it." They were interrupted by Eddie Santos, who knocked tentatively before entering the office. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by obvious nervousness. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation out front." Margaret followed him to the shop floor, where she found Tommy standing near the main entrance, his school backpack slung over one shoulder and his face flushed with anger. "Grandma," he said as soon as he saw her, "we need to talk." Margaret glanced around the shop, noting that several employees were within earshot. "Tommy, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school?" "I had a free period," he said, which they both knew was a lie. "I heard Dad and Great-Grandma talking this morning about those places they want to send you." Margaret felt her heart sink. Tommy's moral compass was finely tuned, and Derek's treatment of her had been testing his patience for months. But this wasn't the time or place for family confrontations. "We should discuss this at home," she said gently. "No," Tommy said with surprising firmness. "I'm tired of pretending everything's okay when it's not. Dad treats you like garbage, and now his mother shows up and suddenly they're planning to ship you off somewhere. It's not right." Several mechanics had stopped working to listen, their attention drawn by the unusual scene of a teenager defending an elderly woman with such passion. Margaret realized that her two worlds were colliding whether she was ready or not. "Tommy," she said carefully, "your father loves me. He's just trying to do what he thinks is best." "That's bullshit," Tommy said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sorry for the language, but it is. Dad doesn't love you. He tolerates you. There's a difference. Carlos stepped closer, his protective instincts engaged. Everything okay here? Mrs. Chen? The simple question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Carlos had used her title naturally, professionally in front of Tommy. Margaret saw her grandson's eyes widen as he registered the interaction, the obvious respect in Carlos's voice, the way he deferred to her authority. Tommy, Margaret said. Quietly, we really should continue this conversation at home. But Tommy was looking around the shop with new eyes, taking in the busy mechanics, the organized workflow, the signs of successful enterprise. His gaze settled on the office door, where financial charts were visible through the glass partition. Grandma, he said slowly, what is this place? Margaret felt the moment crystallizing around her like ice forming on a window. She could lie, deflect, maintain the charade a little longer, or she could trust her grandson with the truth and begin the process of reclaiming her identity. It's my business, she said simply. Tommy stared at her, processing the implications. Around them, the shop continued its normal operations, but Margaret could feel the attention of her employees as they realized something significant was happening. Your business? Tommy repeated. Chen's Auto Repair, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I own it. I run it. I have for the past 18 months. Tommy's mouth fell open. But Dad said, everyone thinks. Everyone thinks I'm a helpless widow who can barely take care of herself, Margaret finished. That was the idea. Carlos smiled broadly, clearly enjoying the revelation. Your grandmother employs 12 people, Tommy, and she's about to expand the operation significantly. Tommy looked from Margaret to Carlos and back again, his worldview shifting in real time. Does Mom know? No one knows except Carlos and a few others, Margaret said. I wanted to keep it quiet while I grieved your grandfather and figured out what I wanted to do with my life. And now? Margaret thought about the morning's conversation, about Rita's research and Derek's eager complicity in planning her exile. Now I think it's time people learned the truth. Tommy's anger had transformed into something else, amazement, pride, and a burning sense of injustice for all the condescension his grandmother had endured. Dad's going to lose his mind, he said with obvious satisfaction. That's the idea, Margaret replied. They were interrupted by the arrival of a city truck, its driver looking for Margaret to discuss the upcoming expansion project. Carlos started to intercede, but Margaret stopped him with a gesture. I'm Margaret Chen, she told the driver. How can I help you? Tommy watched the interaction with fascination as his grandmother discussed zoning requirements, construction, timelines, and permit procedures with the casual authority of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. This wasn't the frail woman who shuffled around the house asking for help opening jars. After the city representative left, Tommy turned to his grandmother with newfound respect. How long have you been planning this? The business or the revelation? Oh, both. Margaret smiled. The business happened gradually. The revelation started this morning when your great-grandmother decided I needed to be institutionalized for everyone's convenience. Tommy's face darkened again. That's what this is about? She wants to get rid of you? She wants to reorganize the family according to her preferences, Margaret said carefully. I'm an obstacle to that reorganization. This is insane, Tommy said. When Dad finds out what you've built here, he's going to feel like such an idiot. Maybe, Margaret said, or maybe he'll find a way to rationalize it. People can be remarkably creative when their worldview is threatened. Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing everything he'd learned. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. Grandma, why didn't you tell us? Why let them treat you like that? It was the question Margaret had been asking herself for months. The answer was complicated, rooted in grief. and family dynamics and her own need to be needed. Because I was scared, she said honestly. After your grandfather died, I felt so lost. Living with your family, being close to you and your mother, it gave me purpose. I was afraid that if I revealed how capable I really was, you might not need me anymore. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, Tommy said with the bluntness of youth. We need you because we love you, not because you're helpless. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Not everyone sees it that way. Then they're idiots, Tommy said firmly, and it's time they learned better. As Margaret drove Tommy back to school, in her own car, which supposedly she was too frail to operate safely, she felt something shifting inside her chest. The careful balance she'd maintained for 2 years was finally breaking down, but instead of fear, she felt liberation. Tonight, she would endure another dinner with Rita's passive-aggressive commentary and Derek's eager compliance. Tomorrow, they would begin their tours of senior living facilities, with Rita and Derek convinced they were shepherding a confused old woman toward appropriate care. But by next week, construction equipment would arrive at Chen's auto repair. Permits would be posted, contractors would begin work, and the expansion that would make her business impossible to hide would commence. Margaret smiled as she imagined. Derek's face when he realized that his burden of a mother-in-law owned the thriving business next door to his house. The thought sustained her through the rest of the afternoon and armed her for whatever Rita had planned for dinner. The game was almost over. Soon, it would be time to reveal who had really been winning all along. Part 5. The Ultimatum. The game was almost over. Soon, it would be time to reveal who had really been winning all along. Margaret held on to that thought as she returned from dropping Tommy at school, steeling herself for whatever fresh humiliation Rita had orchestrated during her absence. The house felt different when she entered through the back door, charged with the electricity that preceded storms. Rita's voice carried from the living room, pitched in the particular tone she used when delivering ultimatums disguised as reasonable requests. I just think we need to be practical about the sleeping arrangements, Rita was saying to Derek, her voice carrying the weight of maternal authority. At my age, I need proper rest. All this shuffling around at night, people coming and going. It's very disruptive. Margaret paused in the kitchen, recognizing the setup. Rita was building her case methodically, establishing her needs as paramount while positioning Margaret's presence as the source of disruption. I understand completely, Mom, Derek replied with the eager compliance of someone desperate to solve his mother's problems. What do you think would work better? Well, I hate to say it, but I think Margaret needs her own space. Somewhere she can come and go without disturbing the rest of the household. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She'd expected this moment. But Rita's efficiency was breathtaking. In less than 4 days, she'd identified the problem, developed a solution, and convinced Derek to implement it. Her own space? Derek's voice carried genuine confusion, as if the concept of Margaret having territorial rights was foreign to him. The garage, Rita said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather. It's really quite spacious, and it would give her the independence she needs to adjust to living on her own again. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Rita was reframing exile as gift-giving, punishment as privilege. The garage, a space for cars and storage, was being presented as suitable accommodation for a family member. Margaret entered the living room with her practiced shuffle, noting how Derek and Rita sat together on the couch like co-conspirators. Their body language suggested decisions had already been made. This conversation was mere formality. Margaret, dear, Rita said with radiant false warmth, we were just discussing how to make everyone more comfortable during my visit. Oh! Margaret kept her voice mild, though she could feel fury building in her chest like pressure in a boiler. Derek cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mom, we've been thinking about the space situation. With Rita needing her rest, and you sometimes moving around at night. I don't move around at night, Margaret said quietly. Rita waved a dismissive hand. Of course you do, dear. All older people do. It's perfectly natural. The bladder, you know, sleep patterns changing. Nothing to be embarrassed about. The casual assumption of incontinence was so degrading, so calculated, that Margaret felt her vision blur with rage. Rita was systematically stripping away her dignity, reducing her to a collection of supposed ailments and inconveniences. The point is, Derek continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme, we think it might be better if you had your own space for the rest of Rita's visit. Just temporarily. What kind of space? Margaret asked, though she already knew. Derek's smile was brilliant with false enthusiasm. The garage, it's actually quite roomy, and we could set up a nice little area for you. Very private, very independent. Margaret looked from Derek to Rita, seeing the satisfaction in their faces. They'd solved their problem with elegant efficiency. Margaret would be removed from the house but not technically thrown out, exiled but in a way that could be presented as temporary accommodation. The garage, Margaret repeated flatly. Just think of it as your own apartment, Rita said brightly. Your own entrance, your own space, no one bothering you. Really, it's quite liberating when you think about it. Liberating. The word tasted like ash in Margaret's mouth. Rita was describing imprisonment as freedom, relegation as elevation. I know it seems unusual, Derek said, misreading her silence as reluctance. But it's really just for a few more days, until we can figure out more permanent arrangements. Permanent arrangements. Margaret heard the threat clearly. This wasn't about Rita's visit. This was the first step toward her complete removal from the family structure. Where would I sleep? She asked, genuinely curious about the logistics of her humiliation. We'll set up a cot, Derek said quickly. And there's that old space heater in the basement. You'll be perfectly comfortable. A cot in an unheated garage. For a woman they supposedly loved and respected. Margaret felt something crystallize inside her chest. Not heartbreak, but clarity. This was who they really were, beneath the pretense of family loyalty. And my things? Just what you need for a few days, Rita said helpfully. No point in moving everything for such a temporary arrangement. Margaret nodded slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. They wanted her in the garage? Fine. The garage was 30 yards from Chen's auto repair. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. All right, she said simply. Derek blinked in surprise. All right? If that's what you think is best. Rita's smile faltered slightly, as if Margaret's easy acquiescence had robbed her of anticipated drama. Well, good. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Reasonable. Margaret had been reasonable for 2 years, accommodating every slight, accepting every diminishment, swallowing every insult in the name of family harmony. She'd been reasonable right up until the moment they asked her to sleep with the lawn. Mower. I'll move my things this afternoon, Margaret said. Derek's relief was palpable. Great, and remember, it's just temporary, just until we figure out what's best for everyone. Margaret climbed the stairs to her room, her mind already shifting into planning mode. They thought they were removing an obstacle. Instead, they were positioning her perfectly for the revelation that would shatter their comfortable assumptions. She packed methodically, clothes for a few days, toiletries, the leather portfolio containing her business documents. Everything else could wait. Tonight, she would sleep in the garage like the burden they believed her to be. Tomorrow, she would begin dismantling their delusions piece by piece. By mid-afternoon, she'd established her temporary quarters in the space between Sarah's Honda and Derek's BMW. The cot was uncomfortable, the space heater inadequate, and the concrete floor unforgiving. But Margaret felt strangely liberated as she arranged her meager belongings in the corner Derek had designated as suitable for family members. Rita inspected her handiwork with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully reorganized an inconvenient situation. "This is really quite cozy," she declared, as if sleeping in a garage were a privilege rather than a punishment. "Your own little retreat." Derek nodded enthusiastically. "And you're still part of the family, just with more privacy." Margaret smiled serenely. "It's perfect." As evening fell and the house settled into its new rhythm, Margaret lay on her cot, listening to the sounds of family life proceeding without her. She could hear Derek and Rita laughing over dinner, their voices carrying through the thin wall that separated the garage from the kitchen. They were celebrating her successful removal, toasting their problem-solving efficiency. Through the garage's side window, she could see the security lights of Chen's auto repair. Her real world, where her competence was valued and her decisions mattered. Tomorrow, she would authorize the construction that would make her secret impossible to maintain. She would hire the additional staff needed for expansion. She would sign the contracts that would establish her as one of the most successful business owners in the county. But tonight, she would sleep in a garage because her family had decided she was too much trouble to accommodate in a house. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed Carlos's number. "Mrs. Chen?" His voice carried immediate concern. "Everything all right?" "Carlos," she said calmly, "I want you to expedite everything. Permits, construction, hiring, equipment orders. I want this expansion to be impossible to ignore." "How fast are we talking?" Margaret looked through the window at the house where Derek and Rita were probably planning her future without her input. "Fast enough to shock some people into reality." "Consider it done," Carlos said with grim satisfaction. "Anything else?" "Yes," Margaret said, feeling the last of her patience finally snap. "Schedule a meeting with that reporter from the Business Journal, the one who wanted to do a story about successful female entrepreneurs." "When?" Margaret smiled in the darkness of her exile. "Next week. Make sure it's visible from the house." As she ended the call, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. The absolute freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. They'd pushed her as far as she could be pushed, humiliated her as thoroughly as she could be. Humiliated. Now it was her turn. Now it was her turn. Margaret lay on the narrow cot, staring up at the garage's exposed rafters where Derek stored his seasonal decorations and rarely used sporting equipment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by the detritus of his abandoned hobbies, sleeping among the physical manifestations of his lack of commitment, golf clubs from his brief attempt at executive networking, camping gear from a single weekend trip that Sarah had insisted on, boxing gloves from his short-lived fitness phase. All evidence of Derek's pattern, grand enthusiasm followed by swift abandonment when reality failed to match expectation. The space heater hummed ineffectively in the corner, its orange glow casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Margaret pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and listened. To the sounds filtering through the shared wall, Derek's laughter was particularly grating, the hearty guffaws of someone who'd successfully solved an irritating problem. "I have to admit, Derek, you handled that perfectly." Rita's voice carried clearly through the drywall. Firm, but kind. Sometimes people need boundaries, even if they don't appreciate them at first. "I just hope she understands it's for the best," Derek replied, though his tone suggested he was more concerned with Rita's approval than Margaret's welfare. "These decisions are never easy, but family means making tough choices." Family. Margaret closed her eyes, processing the word's bitter irony. In Derek's vocabulary, family apparently meant a hierarchy where Rita's comfort superseded everyone else's basic dignity. The conversation continued, their voices warm with self-congratulation as they discussed the wisdom of their decision. They spoke about Margaret as if she were a problematic pet that had been successfully contained rather than a woman who'd raised Sarah, supported their household, and asked for nothing but basic respect in return. Margaret's phone buzzed softly. A text from Tommy. "Are you really sleeping in the garage?" She typed back, "Yes, it's temporary. This is insane. I'm coming out there. No, stay inside. Don't make this worse for your mother." The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before Tommy's next message. "This isn't over." Margaret smiled, despite her circumstances. Tommy's moral clarity was both refreshing and dangerous. Refreshing because it validated her own sense of injustice. Dangerous because his anger could fracture the family beyond repair. She needed to control the revelation, not let it explode. Chaotically. Around 9 o'clock, she heard Sarah's car pull into the driveway. Margaret listened as her daughter entered through the front door, the soft sounds of her evening routine echoing through the house. Then silence. Then raised voices. "Where's Mom?" Sarah's voice cut through the evening air with unusual sharpness. "She's fine," Derek replied, his tone carrying the defensive edge of someone whose actions couldn't withstand scrutiny. "We worked out a temporary arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Margaret heard footsteps moving through the house, Sarah's voice growing more urgent as she searched and found no sign of her mother. "Derek, where is my mother?" "She's in the garage," Rita interjected smoothly. "We thought she might appreciate some private space." The silence that followed was so complete Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. Then Sarah's voice, low and dangerous. "You put my mother in the garage?" "It's temporary," Derek said quickly. "Just until Rita's visit is over. And it was her choice. She agreed to it. She agreed to sleep in the garage. It's actually quite comfortable," Rita added helpfully. "Very private, very independent. Really, at her age, she might prefer—" "Don't." Sarah's voice carried a warning that made Margaret sit up straighter. "Don't you dare tell me what my mother prefers." Margaret heard Derek's attempt at damage control. "Sarah, honey, let's discuss this rationally. We're just trying to make everyone comfortable. By putting my mother in the garage like a piece of unwanted furniture? That's exactly what it is." Sarah's voice was rising, 2 years of suppressed frustration finally finding expression. "This is her home, Derek. Her home." "It's our home," Derek corrected, his own anger surfacing. "Our mortgage, our responsibility, our decision about what works best for everyone." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Derek had revealed his true position. This was his house, and everyone else lived there by his sufferance. Margaret wasn't family. She was a tenant whose lease had expired. The argument continued for another 10 minutes, Sarah's guilt and anger warring, with Derek's defensive justifications and Rita's strategic interventions. But Margaret could hear the inevitable conclusion building. Sarah would protest, Derek would stand firm, and eventually exhaustion would force a temporary peace that changed nothing. Sure enough, the voices gradually died down, replaced by the sounds of evening routines and separate retreats to separate bedrooms. Sarah never came to the garage. Whether from embarrassment, conflict avoidance, or simple emotional exhaustion, she left her mother to spend the night among the lawnmower and recycling bins. Margaret understood. Sarah was fighting a battle on multiple fronts: her demanding career, her marriage, her teenage son, and now her mother's impossible situation. She didn't have the energy to take on Derek and Rita simultaneously, especially when doing so might fracture her marriage beyond repair. But understanding didn't eliminate the pain of abandonment. Around midnight, when the house had settled into silence, Margaret's phone rang. Carlos's name appeared on the screen, unusual for such a late call. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry to call so late, but we just got word from the city. They want to fast-track our expansion approval." Margaret sat up, instantly alert. "What does that mean?" It means instead of waiting 3 weeks for permits, we could break ground Monday. But it requires your signature on some additional paperwork first thing tomorrow morning. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. How visible will the construction be? Impossible to miss. They'll need to bring in heavy equipment, establish a construction perimeter, post signage. The whole neighborhood will know something major is happening. Perfect. Margaret looked toward the house where Derek and Rita were sleeping peacefully, confident in their successful reorganization of family dynamics. Do it, she said quietly. Whatever paperwork needs signing, whatever permits need expediting, whatever contractors need hiring, I want this expansion to be impossible to ignore. Mrs. Chen, Carlos said carefully, once this starts, there's no hiding your involvement anymore. Everyone will know you own this place. Margaret thought about the cot she was lying on, the space heater that barely cut the November chill, the casual cruelty of people who claimed to love her while treating her like an inconvenience. Good, she said. It's time they learned exactly who they've been discarding. After ending the call, Margaret lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin wall, she could hear Derek's satisfied snoring, the sound of a man whose problems had been efficiently solved. Tomorrow, he would wake up believing he'd successfully managed a difficult situation with wisdom and compassion. By Monday morning, his comfortable assumptions would begin crumbling. Margaret closed her eyes and began planning the revelation that would redefine every relationship in her family. She thought about timing, about public perception, about the delicate balance between vindication and destruction. She didn't want to simply prove Derek wrong. She wanted to transform him, to force him to confront the fundamental assumptions that had led to this moment. The garage was cold, uncomfortable, and humiliating. But as Margaret drifted toward sleep, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For 2 years, she'd hidden her strength to preserve family harmony. For 2 years, she'd accepted diminishment to maintain connection. That period of her life was ending. Soon, everyone would learn what Derek's burden had really been accomplishing. While he worried about her ability to manage basic daily tasks, the transformation would begin at dawn. The transformation would begin at dawn. Margaret woke before sunrise, her body protesting the night on an unforgiving cot, but her mind crystal clear with purpose. Through the garage's small window, she could see the first hint of light touching the roof of Chen's auto repair. Her sanctuary, her secret, her weapon. She, dressed carefully in the garage's dim light, choosing clothes that would photograph well, professional but approachable, successful but not intimidating. Today would mark the beginning of her emergence from the shadows, and every detail mattered. The house remained silent as Margaret slipped out through the garage's side door, crossing the 30 yards to her real domain. Carlos was already there, as she'd known he would be, standing beside a wooden crate that had been delivered earlier than expected. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said with a grin that suggested he'd been anticipating this moment as much as she had. "Ready to make some noise?" Margaret looked at the crate, knowing it contained the sign that would change everything. Brushed aluminum letters spelling out Margaret Chen owner in font, large enough to be read from the street. No more hiding behind Carlos's assumed authority. No more pretending to be a silent partner. "Let's do this," she said. They spent the next hour installing the sign, Carlos handling the technical aspects while Margaret supervised with the confident authority of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. By 7 o'clock, just as the neighborhood began stirring with morning routines, the declaration of her ownership was visible to anyone passing by. Margaret stepped back to admire their work, feeling something shift in her chest. For 18 months, she'd been Margaret Chen in this building and Mrs. Martinez everywhere else. Now those two identities were about to collide with explosive force. "Looks good," Carlos said with satisfaction. "Professional, established, like it's been there forever." That was exactly the impression Margaret wanted to create. Not that she'd recently become a business owner, but that she'd always been one. The revelation should suggest competence that had been consistently overlooked, rather than capability that had suddenly emerged. At 8:30, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from the reporter she'd arranged to meet. Jennifer Walsh from the County Business Journal was running slightly late, but would arrive within the hour. Perfect timing. The morning rush would ensure maximum visibility for the interview. Margaret used the delay to review her talking points with Carlos. The story she planned to tell was completely true, but carefully framed. She was a grieving widow who'd channeled her loss into entrepreneurial success, building a thriving business, while maintaining her family relationships. The implication that her family had supported her endeavors would expose Derek's ignorance without requiring Margaret to explicitly criticize him. "Remember," she told Carlos, "if anyone from the family shows up, act natural. Don't reveal that this is planned." Carlos nodded, though his expression suggested he was looking forward to Derek's reaction with unconcealed anticipation. At 9:15, Jennifer Walsh arrived in a sedan that looked official enough to attract attention. Margaret watched through the office window as the young reporter gathered her equipment, noting with satisfaction that Jessica Park from the coffee shop across the street had already emerged to investigate the unusual activity. Jessica was the neighborhood's unofficial information clearinghouse, a cheerful gossip whose coffee shop served as the local communication hub. Her presence guaranteed that news of the interview would spread through the community within hours. "Mrs. Chen?" Jennifer approached with the professional warmth of someone accustomed to putting interview subjects at ease. "Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us. The female entrepreneur angle is really resonating with our readers." Margaret shook her hand with the confidence of someone who'd been managing business relationships for years rather than months. "Please call me Margaret, and thank you for the opportunity." They positioned themselves near the shop's entrance, ensuring the new signage would be visible in any photographs. Margaret had calculated every angle. The interview needed to look spontaneous while actually being carefully orchestrated for maximum impact. "So, tell me," Jennifer began as her photographer prepared his equipment, "what inspired you to start Chen's Auto Repair?" Margaret launched into her practiced narrative, describing how her late husband's death had motivated her to honor his memory through entrepreneurial achievement. She spoke about the challenges of entering a male-dominated industry, the satisfaction of building something meaningful, the pride she felt in employing a dozen skilled workers. Every word was true. Every word was also calculated to demolish Derek's assumptions about her capabilities. "What's been the most rewarding aspect of business ownership?" Jennifer asked. "The respect," Margaret said without hesitation. "In this industry, competence speaks for itself. When you solve problems, meet deadlines, and maintain quality, people judge you by your results rather than their preconceptions." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically, clearly sensing a quotable moment. "Have you faced any particular challenges as an older woman in this field?" Margaret smiled. "Age brings experience. Most of my clients appreciate dealing with someone who's seen enough to anticipate problems before they become crises." As they talked, Margaret noticed movement across the street. Tommy had appeared on his bicycle, ostensibly heading to school but actually drawn by the unusual activity at his grandmother's walking destination. She watched his face change as he took in the scene, the reporter, the photographer, the sign identifying his supposedly helpless grandmother as a business owner. Their eyes met across the distance. Tommy's expression cycled through confusion, realization, and something approaching awe. Margaret gave him a subtle nod, acknowledging his discovery while warning him to stay quiet. This revelation needed to unfold at her pace, not explode chaotically. Tommy remained frozen for several minutes, watching his grandmother field questions about profit margins, employee management, and expansion plans with the casual authority of someone who discussed such matters daily. Margaret could practically see his worldview reshaping in real time. "One final question," Jennifer said as the interview wound down. What advice would you give to other women considering entrepreneurship later in life? Margaret looked directly into the camera, knowing that Tommy would remember this moment forever. Don't let other people's assumptions about your limitations become your own. Age, gender, circumstances, these are just data points. They don't define what you're capable of achieving. As the reporter packed up her equipment, Margaret noticed another familiar car approaching. Sarah's Honda slowed as it passed the shop, her daughter's face visible through the windshield as she processed the scene. The sign, the reporter, her mother standing confidently in front of a business she apparently owned. Sarah parked across the street and sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the sign with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read from this distance. Finally, Sarah pulled out her phone, presumably calling someone, Derek most likely, or perhaps trying to reach Margaret directly. Margaret's phone remained silent. She wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The morning's work was done. The sign was installed, the interview completed, the neighborhood alerted to Margaret Chen's existence as something other than Derek's dependent mother-in-law. Jessica Park was already on her phone, undoubtedly spreading the news through her network of coffee shop regulars. By evening, the revelation would be impossible to contain. Derek would be forced to confront the reality that his burden was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the community. Margaret felt a deep satisfaction as she watched Sarah drive away, her daughter's world clearly rocked by discoveries that challenged everything she thought she knew about her mother. The guilt would be overwhelming. 2 years of watching Margaret endure condescension while remaining silent about her actual accomplishments. But guilt could be transformative if channeled properly. Margaret hoped Sarah would emerge from this experience with a clearer understanding of her own worth and a stronger spine for future battles. Tonight, Margaret would sleep in the garage, one final time. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, everything would change. Margaret was arranging her meager belongings on the makeshift shelf Derek had grudgingly installed when she heard Sarah's car door slam with unusual force. Through the garage window, she watched her daughter stride toward the house with the purposeful gait of someone preparing for battle. The front door opened and closed with barely controlled violence. "Derek!" Sarah's voice carried through the walls with unprecedented authority. "We need to talk. Now." Margaret could hear movement in the house. Derek's confused response, Rita's attempt to intervene. But Sarah's voice cut through the domestic noise like a blade. "Not you, Rita. This is between my husband and me." Margaret felt a flicker of pride. After 2 years of watching Sarah accommodate everyone else's needs, her daughter was finally claiming her own space. 10 minutes later, Sarah appeared at the garage door. Her face was flushed with a combination of anger, shame, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify, perhaps respect. "Mom," Sarah said simply, "we need to talk." Margaret gestured to the single folding chair Derek had provided. "Have a seat, though I'm afraid the accommodations are limited." Sarah remained standing, her energy too volatile for sitting. "I saw the sign. At the shop. Your shop." "Yes. How long?" 18 months. Sarah closed her eyes as if processing a physical blow. 18 months. You've owned a business for 18 months and you never told me. Margaret heard the hurt beneath the anger and chose her words carefully. "I told no one except Carlos and the necessary professionals." "Why?" The question exploded from Sarah with 2 years of accumulated frustration. "Why would you hide something like that? Do you know how I've been defending you? How I've been making excuses for what I thought was your declining capabilities?" "What kind of excuses?" Sarah's face crumpled. "When Derek complained about you being underfoot, I said you were grieving. When Rita criticized your usefulness, I said you were doing your best. When they talked about finding you appropriate care, I said you deserve to stay with family." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "You've been protecting me." "I've been patronizing you." Sarah's voice cracked. just like everyone else, assuming you needed protection instead of recognizing that you were building something incredible right under our noses. Margaret stepped closer to her daughter, seeing clearly for the first time the toll these 2 years had taken on Sarah. The exhaustion wasn't just from her demanding job, it was from carrying the emotional weight of a family that had forgotten how to function without conflict. "Sarah," Margaret said gently, "I hid the business because I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of this conversation. Of having to choose between my independence and my family." Sarah stared at her mother with dawning comprehension. "You thought we'd make you choose?" "Wouldn't you have? If Derek had known I was capable of running a successful business, would he have been comfortable with me living in his house? Or would he have decided I didn't need family support anymore?" Sarah opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as the truth of Margaret's words settled. Derek's treatment of her mother had been consistently patronizing, built on assumptions of dependency that justified his sense of superiority. "You're right," Sarah admitted quietly. "He would have found a way to make it about his pride. And you would have been caught in the middle just like you are now." They stood in silence for a moment, two women finally seeing each other clearly. Margaret could see the shame in her daughter's eyes, shame at her own passivity, at her failure to stand up to Derek's treatment of her mother. "I should have protected you," Sarah said. "You did protect me, just not from the right people." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Derek's BMW pulling into the driveway with aggressive speed. Car doors slammed, voices carried. Across the yard, Derek and Rita returning from whatever errand had taken them out during the morning's revelation. Through the garage window, Margaret could see Derek's face as he noticed the activity across the street. Jessica Park was visible in her coffee shop doorway, clearly engaged in animated conversation with two customers. All three were looking toward Chen's auto repair, where the new signage gleamed in the afternoon sun. Derek's expression progressed from confusion to suspicion to something approaching panic as he processed the implications of the neighborhood's obvious interest in the business next door. "What's going on?" they heard him ask Rita, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Rita's response was inaudible, but Derek's reaction was immediate. He strode toward the coffee shop with the determined gait of someone demanding answers. Margaret watched Jessica's animated explanation, noting the exact moment Derek's worldview began crumbling. His face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, humiliation, before settling into the frozen mask he wore when his authority was challenged. Rita remained by the car, her own expression calculating as she absorbed this unexpected complication to her family reorganization plans. Derek returned to the house at near sprint speed, bursting through the front door with enough force to rattle the windows. "Sarah!" His voice boomed through the house. "Where's your mother?" "In the garage," Sarah called back, her tone carefully neutral. "Where you put her?" Margaret heard Derek's footsteps approaching, each step heavy with indignation. He appeared in the garage doorway like an avenging angel, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "Jessica Park is telling people you own that auto shop. She says there was a reporter here this morning interviewing you about your business success." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Jessica Park is well-informed. That's impossible. You don't own a business. You can barely manage your own daily routine." "Derek," Sarah warned, but he ignored her. "This is some kind of mistake," Derek continued, his voice rising. "Some kind of confusion. You're not a business owner. You're barely functional as an independent adult." Margaret felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. 2 years of accumulated insults, 2 years of condescending treatment, 2 years of being treated like a burden finally reached their breaking point. "I employ 12 people," she said quietly. "I generate more revenue in a month than you earn in a quarter. I've expanded the business twice since I bought it, and I'm currently negotiating a municipal contract that will triple our annual profits. Derek stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. That's impossible. Is it? Or is it just impossible for you to imagine that the woman you've been treating like a charity case might actually be more successful than you are? Rita appeared behind Derek, her expression sharp with the calculation of someone whose plans had encountered an unexpected obstacle. Margaret, dear, I think there might be some confusion here. Perhaps someone is using your name without permission. These things happen to vulnerable people. Margaret turned her attention to Rita, seeing clearly for the first time the manipulative intelligence behind the grandmother's mask. The only confusion here is the assumption that age equals incompetence. But surely, there's no surely about it, Margaret interrupted. I own Chen's Auto Repair. I've owned it for 18 months. I'm expanding it next week. These are facts, not delusions. Derek's face was cycling through expressions as his mind struggled to reconcile this information with his carefully constructed worldview. If this is true, he said slowly, then why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Why let you think I was helpless? Margaret finished. Because you needed to think that. It made you feel important, necessary, superior. My dependency validated your sense of being the family provider. That's not... It's exactly true. Tommy's voice cut through the garage from the doorway. Margaret turned to see her grandson standing with his shoulders squared, his young face set with determination. Dad, you've been treating Grandma like garbage for 2 years, and now you find out she's more successful than you'll ever be. Derek spun to face his son, his authority challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. Tommy, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, Tommy shot back with newfound confidence. You put my grandmother in the garage like she was a piece of unwanted furniture, and the whole time, she was running a business that's probably worth more than this house. The truth of Tommy's words hung in the air like an accusation. Derek looked from his son to his wife to his mother-in-law, seeing his family structure crumbling around him. This is insane, he said finally. I need to see proof, financial records, documentation, something concrete. Margaret smiled. Tomorrow morning you can review the expansion contracts I'll be signing, the ones that will bring construction equipment to the lot next door, the ones that will make my business impossible to ignore. Derek stared at her for a long moment, his face working through emotions he couldn't quite process. Finally, he turned and walked away, his retreat marking the end of 2 years of comfortable assumptions. Rita remained in the doorway, her expression unreadable. This changes things, she said quietly. Yes, Margaret agreed. It changes everything. As Rita followed Derek into the house, Sarah moved closer to her mother. Mom, I'm so sorry, for all of it. For not standing up to him, for not seeing what was right in front of me. Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. You see it now, that's what matters. Through the garage window, they could see Derek pacing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, investigating most likely, calling contacts, checking records, trying to find some explanation that would preserve his worldview. He would find none. Tomorrow, the construction would begin, and the last vestiges of Margaret's secret life would disappear forever. Tonight, she would sleep in the garage one final time. Tomorrow, she would reclaim her place in the family, not as a dependent to be managed, but as an equal to be respected. Tonight, she would sleep in the garage one final time. Tomorrow, she would reclaim her place in the family, not as a dependent to be managed, but as an equal to be respected. Derek spent a sleepless night on his phone and laptop, calling contacts and searching public records with the desperate thoroughness of someone whose reality was dissolving. By morning, he'd confirmed Margaret's business license, reviewed her tax filings, and spoken with 3 different municipal officials who praised Chen's Auto Repair's reliability and professionalism. The numbers were undeniable. Margaret's business generated more annual revenue than his corporate salary. Her expansion plans represented an investment larger than his retirement savings. Every document he uncovered only reinforced the magnitude of his miscalculation. At 8 o'clock Friday morning, Derek stood across the street from Chen's auto repair, watching Margaret move through her domain with the confident efficiency of someone completely in command. She directed 2 mechanics on a complex transmission rebuild, while simultaneously consulting with a parts supplier about delivery schedules. This wasn't the shuffling, confused woman who asked for help opening jars. Derek crossed the street like a man approaching his own execution. "Can I help you?" Carlos asked, emerging from under the hood of a police cruiser. "I'm Derek Martinez," Derek said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Margaret's son-in-law." Carlos's expression shifted, professional courtesy warring with protective loyalty. "Mr. Martinez, what can we do for you?" "I need to understand what my mother-in-law has built here." Carlos studied Derek for a long moment, apparently debating how much truth this man could handle. "Come on, let me show you around." The tour was a systematic demolition of Derek's assumptions. Carlos explained Margaret's hiring philosophy, her equipment investments, her customer retention strategies. He showed Derek the expansion plans, the municipal contracts, the testimonials from satisfied clients. "Mrs. Chen doesn't just run this place," Carlos said as they stood in the office reviewing financial projections. "She transformed it. When she bought the business, we were struggling to stay afloat. Now, we're the most successful independent shop in the county." Derek stared at the profit margins displayed on Margaret's computer screen. She bought this place? Paid cash. Used her savings and Robert's life insurance to purchase it outright, then invested her own money in improvements. The revelation hit Derek like a physical blow. While he'd been worrying about Margaret's finances, she'd been making decisions that demonstrated both courage and business acumen he couldn't match. "What's she like as a boss?" Derek asked, though he dreaded the answer. Carlos's smile was genuine. "Fair but demanding. She expects excellence but supports you when you struggle. Most of us would follow her anywhere." Eddie Santos approached, wiping grease from his hands. "You're Sarah's husband, right? Mrs. Chen's?" "Shown us pictures. She's proud of her family." Derek felt shame burn in his chest. Margaret had been proud of a family that treated her as a burden. "She talks about you a lot," Eddie continued. "Says you work hard to provide for everyone. She respects that." The kindness in Margaret's characterization of him, despite everything, was almost unbearable. Derek excused himself and walked to Jessica Park's coffee shop, where the investigation continued without his intention. "Oh, you're Margaret's son-in-law," Jessica said brightly. "Isn't she wonderful? She's helped 3 small businesses on this block with their bookkeeping. Never charges a dime." Derek learned that Margaret had become an informal business mentor, sharing her expertise with struggling entrepreneurs. She'd helped the flower shop negotiate better supplier contracts. She'd advised the bakery on inventory management. She'd even provided emergency loans to 2 businesses facing temporary cash flow problems. "She's got such a good heart," Jessica continued, "always thinking about how to help others succeed." Derek walked home in a daze, his investigation having revealed not just Margaret's business success but her generosity, leadership, and positive impact on an entire community. The woman he'd relegated to a garage was more accomplished and respected than he'd ever been. Rita was waiting in the living room when he arrived, her expression carefully neutral. "Well?" she asked. Derek sank into his chair, feeling every one of his 42 years. "It's all true. Everything she said and more." Rita's mask slipped slightly. "How much more?" "She's probably worth 3 times what I am, and everyone who knows her thinks she's remarkable." Rita absorbed this information with visible calculation. "Well?" she said finally. I always sensed there was something special about Margaret, something the rest of you were too busy to notice. Derek stared at his mother, watching her rewrite history in real time to preserve her own dignity. Less than 24 hours ago, Rita had been advocating for Margaret's exile. Now she was claiming prescient recognition of qualities no one else had seen. You wanted to put her in a nursing home? Derek said flatly. I wanted what was best for everyone, Rita corrected smoothly. And now we know what that is, recognizing Margaret's contributions and giving her the respect she deserves. Derek felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but his faith in his own judgment. For 2 years, he'd been treating a successful entrepreneur like a helpless dependent. He'd been patronizing someone more accomplished than himself. He'd been managing someone who should have been managing him. The garage exile suddenly looked like what it truly was. Not prudent family management, but petty cruelty directed at someone whose only crime was making him feel inadequate by comparison. Derek stood slowly, knowing he had a reckoning to face and apologies to make that would never feel sufficient. Margaret deserved better than his family had given her. Question now was whether he could become worthy of her respect. Margaret deserved better than his family had given her. The question now was whether he could become worthy of her respect. Derek found Margaret in the garage Saturday morning, efficiently packing her belongings with the brisk movements of someone eager to move forward. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but not hostile, the face of someone willing to listen but no longer willing to accommodate. Margaret, Derek began, then stopped. The words he'd rehearsed felt inadequate in the face of what he'd learned about her and himself. I owe you an apology that I can never make properly. Margaret continued folding clothes, but he could see she was listening. I treated you like a burden when you were an asset. I patronized you when I should have been learning from you. I put you in a garage when you deserved respect. Derek's voice cracked slightly. I was threatened by your competence and too proud to admit it. Margaret set down the sweater she'd been folding and finally met his eyes. And I want to earn your forgiveness. Not buy it with apologies, but earn it through changed behavior. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her own face marked by sleepless guilt. Mom, I failed you too. I should have stood up to Derek years ago. I should have seen what was happening and protected you. Margaret looked at her daughter with gentle understanding. You were trying to hold the family together. I understand that burden. It's not an excuse, Sarah said firmly. I was a coward when you needed me to be brave. Tommy emerged from behind Sarah, his young face serious with newfound maturity. Grandma, I want to work at the shop. Really work, not just visit. I want to learn the business. Margaret smiled for the first time that morning. Carlos would love the help, but you finish school first. Rita entered last, her expression carefully composed but lacking her usual commanding presence. The revelation of Margaret's success had forced even her to recalculate family dynamics. Margaret, Rita said with uncharacteristic humility, I misjudged you. I let assumptions cloud my vision of who you really are. Margaret studied Rita with clear eyes. Thank you for saying that. I'd like to start over if you'll allow it. Margaret nodded slowly. We all get a chance to start over. But this time, we start with truth. Derek cleared his throat. What would truth look like, going forward? Truth looks like me moving back into the house as an equal family member, not a dependent, Margaret said clearly. Truth looks like decisions affecting me being made with me, not for me. Truth looks like respect for my accomplishments and my autonomy. And if we fail to meet those standards? Sarah asked. Margaret's smile was gentle but steel-edged. Then I have my own place to go. A successful business that needs me, employees who respect me, and a community that values my contributions. Derek felt the shift in power dynamics settle around them like a new gravity. Margaret was no longer asking for her place in the family. She was granting them the privilege of remaining in her life. "One more thing," Margaret said, turning to Derek. "The garage conversation never happened. We're moving forward, not backward." Derek nodded, understanding that her forgiveness came with the requirement that he become worthy of it. As Margaret gathered her belongings from the garage for the last time, the family formed an unconscious circle around her. Not to protect her, but to be protected by her strength, her wisdom, her remarkable grace under pressure. The matriarch had revealed herself. The family's real foundation had been exposed. And for the first time in 2 years, they all stood on solid ground. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.